Welcome to my video. Please subscribe my channel. The America First trade agenda emerged as a bold promise to restore American prosperity by putting domestic industries and workers at the very center of economic policy. Advocates argued that decades of free trade agreements and globalization had hollowed out the nation's manufacturing base, sending jobs overseas and leaving American workers behind. The new doctrine sought to reverse this trend, vowing to rebuild the country's industrial strength and ensure that American-made goods would once again dominate both domestic and global markets. It framed international trade as a zero-sum game, where every gain for a foreign competitor was seen as a direct loss for the United States. This perspective fueled a sense of urgency and competition, shaping the administration's approach to global commerce. By imposing tariffs and trade barriers, the goal was to bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil, revitalize struggling industries, and reduce the nation's reliance on foreign supply chains. The hope was that these measures would spark a renaissance in American manufacturing, creating new opportunities for workers and communities that had long felt left behind. Supporters of the America First doctrine saw these policies as a necessary correction after decades of what they viewed as misguided globalization. They believed that America's vast market size and economic power gave it ultimate leverage in trade negotiations, allowing the country to dictate terms and protect its own interests. However, this approach often overlooked the intricate complexity of modern, global supply chains. Even products proudly labeled "Made in USA" typically rely on a web of components and raw materials sourced from all over the world. From electronics to automobiles, American industries are deeply intertwined with international partners, making true economic isolation nearly impossible. This critical miscalculation would soon be exposed in the copper market, a sector vital to everything from electronics to infrastructure. As the U.S. pushed forward with its protectionist agenda, it underestimated the leverage held by its closest trading partners, especially Canada, whose resources and cooperation proved essential to American industry. In October 2025, the U.S. government made a bold move. It officially declared copper a critical resource, essential not just for economic growth, but for national security and the future of American manufacturing. This announcement sent shockwaves through global markets, signaling a new era of resource nationalism. Almost overnight, Washington imposed a sweeping 50% tariff on all copper imports. The stated goal was clear: reduce dependence on foreign copper, protect American jobs, and ensure that the nation's infrastructure and technology sectors would never be held hostage by global supply disruptions. The administration framed the tariff as a necessary step to reclaim economic independence and strengthen the country's industrial backbone. The plan was ambitious: make imported copper prohibitively expensive, spark a renaissance in domestic mining, and roll back decades of environmental regulations on U.S. smelters to rapidly ramp up output. Officials promised a new wave of investment, jobs, and innovation, painting a picture of American factories humming with activity, powered by homegrown copper. Washington assumed that Canada, its largest and most reliable copper supplier, would have little choice but to absorb the new costs or quickly negotiate for an exemption. After all, the U.S. market was massive, and Canadian producers had long relied on American buyers. The administration believed that America's sheer market power would force compliance, envisioning a future where American-mined copper fueled a revitalized manufacturing sector. They saw the tariff as a lever to restore industrial might and secure supply chains, for everything from electric vehicles to defense systems. But this strategy overlooked two critical realities: the immense time and investment needed to rebuild domestic mining capacity, and, perhaps more importantly, Canada's own leverage and global options. Canadian producers weren't without alternatives. They could redirect exports to eager buyers in Asia and Europe. The U.S. viewed Canada as a dependent supplier, failing to recognize that in today's interconnected world, reliable resource providers hold significant power. Canadian mining executives began exploring new contracts and trade routes, weighing their options on the global stage. As both nations braced for the fallout, the stage was set for a high-stakes collision between American protectionism and Canadian leverage, one that would test alliances, reshape industries, and redefine the future of North American trade. Canada didn't protest or plead for an exemption. Instead, it pivoted. Recognizing its leverage, Canada quietly secured new, long-term copper contracts with major industrial nations like Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Canadian copper exports to the U.S. slowed dramatically, while shipments to Europe and Asia surged. This wasn't retaliation, just smart business. Canada redirected its product to welcoming markets, leaving the U.S. to face the consequences of its own policy. While Washington waited for negotiations, Canada had already moved on. America's assumption that it was the only market that mattered had been shattered, setting the stage for a domestic crisis. The fallout was immediate in the American Midwest, where factories suddenly faced a copper shortage. Domestic smelters couldn't meet demand, and production lines for everything from wiring to auto parts slowed or stopped. Copper prices soared, doubling and then tripling, devastating manufacturers and forcing layoffs and closures. The tariff meant to protect jobs instead destroyed them, as small businesses collapsed under skyrocketing costs. Everyday Americans felt the pain. Cars, appliances and homes became more expensive and scarce. The dream of self-sufficiency had become a nightmare of scarcity and inflation. The policy's failure was clear. Ideology had trumped economic reality, and the heartland was in crisis. As the U.S. struggled, the rest of the world adapted quickly. European and Asian manufacturers, now with secure Canadian copper contracts, gained a competitive edge as American factories faltered. The U.S. became an island of high costs, pricing its goods out of the global market. Developing nations, caught in the scramble for copper, faced rising prices and stalled growth. The American tariff destabilized the global market, isolating the U.S. and hurting allies and competitors alike. In weeks, the U.S. lost influence and competitiveness, proving that no country can dictate global supply chains alone. The world moved on, leaving America to deal with the crisis it had created. Political pressure mounted as the tariff's victims, manufacturers, workers, and small businesses, demanded action. Wall Street panicked, markets plunged, and recession fears grew. The administration, once confident, now had to plead with Canada to restore copper exports. The power dynamic had flipped. Washington was desperate, Ottawa was in control. Canada refused a simple return to the old status quo, seeking to resolve broader trade grievances. The U.S. faced a humbling reversal, forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The cost of miscalculation was about to become painfully clear. With its economy teetering on the edge of a deep recession, the United States found itself in a position it hadn't faced in decades, negotiating from a place of vulnerability. The stakes were high, and the world was watching as American and Canadian officials gathered for a series of tense, high-level talks. Both sides knew that the outcome would shape the future of North American trade for years to come. Canada, having suffered from sudden U.S. tariffs in the past, came to the table with firm demands: the permanent removal of the copper tariff and ironclad exemptions from any future steel and aluminum tariffs. Canadian negotiators were determined not to let history repeat itself. They pushed for long-term guarantees and a new, more balanced framework for economic partnership, one that would protect Canadian industries and ensure stability for both nations. Canada was no longer willing to be subjected to the unpredictability of sudden U.S. trade actions. The message was clear: future cooperation would require mutual respect and trust. Meanwhile, the U.S. faced mounting economic pressure at home. With industries faltering and jobs at risk, American leaders realized that compromise was not just preferable, it was necessary. Ultimately, the U.S. conceded to Canada's demands, repealing the copper tariff and granting permanent exemptions. In return, Canada agreed to restore copper exports to the U.S., helping to stabilize American manufacturing. However, Canada also honored its new contracts with Europe and Asia, diversifying its trade relationships and reducing its dependence on the U.S. market. The U.S. found itself in a changed market, with new competition and fewer guarantees. The era of easy dominance was over. The crisis forced both countries to rethink the wisdom of protectionism. It became clear that in a globalized world, unilateral actions could backfire, harming allies and domestic industries alike. The new agreement was more than just a trade deal. It was a recognition of the interconnectedness of modern economies and the need for cooperation over isolation. For both nations, it marked a turning point, a commitment to dialogue, partnership, and shared prosperity. The lesson was unmistakable. Cooperation is not just beneficial, it's essential for survival in a rapidly changing world. Even the most powerful nations need reliable partners to thrive. The New Deal for North America was a testament to that enduring truth. The copper crisis left a lasting mark, teaching that national strength comes from resilient partnerships, not isolation. Canada emerged more assertive, diversifying its trade and leveraging its resource power. The U.S. learned that market size alone doesn't guarantee leverage. Suppliers matter too. The crisis forced a humbling reassessment. Interdependence is a reality, not a weakness. A new, more collaborative approach to trade began to take shape, valuing allies and shared prosperity. The copper tariff became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overestimating one's power and underestimating partners. True strength lies in building bridges, not walls, a lesson for a smarter, more prosperous future.